So the session this morning that I want to talk with you about is enhancing performance. And I'm going to focus on the responsibility of people leaders and share with you a couple of models that hopefully you can take back to your organizations to enhance performance among your employees. As was already mentioned, I have the pleasure of serving as Chief Human Resources Officer for Rotary International and the Rotary Foundation. Any Rotarians in the room? Great, I'm so glad to be here with you today. In addition to working at our world headquarters in Chicago, Illinois, United States of America, we have two offices here in India, one in New Delhi and one in Pune. And it's always my pleasure to visit India, which I consider to be my home away from home. Only last year interrupted my travels, and so I was not able to visit those offices and come to the World HRD Congress. So it's my pleasure to be back here to celebrate the 30th anniversary with all of you. In addition to my work with Rotary, I also serve as the chair of the board of directors for the International Accreditors for Continuing Education and Training, headquartered in Washington, D.C. in the United States. This is an organization that accredits training providers to issue CEUs, continuing education units. It was established by the United States Department of Education in the 1960s to try to quantify non-academic education. And the group that became IACET developed what we now know as the CEU, the Continuing Education Unit. We do have a couple of organizations here in India that are accredited by IACET, and we would, of course, welcome other organizations to join us. So a few objectives that I have for the session today. First one is to apply influence to strengthen supervisor-subordinate relationships. Second is to use a performance assessment model. And the third is to learn to adjust variables of performance to improve productivity and results. And I'll walk through each of these, and they'll start to make a little more sense as we progress in the session. Before I jump into the content, though, I'd like to ask you a question. Who has primary accountability for performance at your organization? And notice that the word primary is in all caps and bold and underlined, because I understand that everybody has responsibility. But my question is, who has primary responsibility in your organizations? So for those of you who say managers, please raise your hand. For those of you who say employees, please raise your hand. Okay, I'm going to test this, and I'll ask you again at the end of the session your thoughts around the same question. So again, I'm here to talk about enhancing performance, how people leaders impact productivity and results. Notice that I refer to those who have human beings reporting to them in an official employment relationship capacity as people leaders, not as managers or supervisors. Because I truly believe that we need to focus on the relationships between managers and their direct reports. Employees don't want their performance managed. What they want are clear, achievable expectations. They want their contributions to be recognized. They want opportunities for growth and development. They want to be treated fairly. They want to be respected. They want to feel like they're making a difference, and they want to feel like they matter. Those are the things that employees want. So how can we use that information to help influence them and motivate and inspire them to higher productivity and better results? Very early in my career, I was trying to figure out how we, as people leaders, tell ourselves stories about how to manage employees. And I realized that a lot of pain that we feel in our professional careers comes from having a story in the wrong place. And let me give you an example of what I mean by this. And in trying to conceptualize this, I came up with what I've referred to as the sphere of control. And in everything we do in life, it falls somewhere in one of these circles of the sphere of control. In the center of the sphere is total control. So that blue circle, those are the things that we have absolutely total control over. And to some extent, our degree of control, our influence are impacted by external variables. But things like, what tie am I going to wear today? And what am I going to eat for breakfast? And what am I going to eat for lunch? And where do I want to travel on vacation? Those kinds of things are within my control. For the most part, I can make those decisions independently. The next circle is what I call influence. So these are things that we don't necessarily have control over, but we have influence over. including performance, productivity, and results of our employees. We cannot control people. If that worked, all we would have to do is tell people what to do, and it would always be done. And we know that that's not how life works. So understanding that we don't necessarily have total control, but we do have influence, can help us be better people leaders. The next circle is interest. These are things that I don't have control over, nor can I really influence, but I have interest in them. Things like the cost of petrol. I don't have control over how much it costs to fill up my tank. I don't even necessarily have influence, although you could argue that there is some influence in terms of supply and demand using basic principles of economics. However, the reality is that we don't have much influence even over the price of gas or petrol. But we do have an interest, because literally everything we buy has a price that's influenced and impacted by the cost of gas or petrol. And so as the cost of gas goes up, prices go up. So we have an interest in that, but we don't have control, we don't necessarily have influence. And then the last circle, I never really did come up with a good name, so if you have one for me, I'd love to hear it. I just called it everything else. These are the things that I don't have control over, I don't have influence over, and I don't really have much interest in, but they exist in the universe. So again, control is the stuff I have total control over, influence is the stuff that I have influence over, interest, the stuff I can't control or influence, but that still has a significant impact on me, and everything else is the stuff I can't do any of those things for. So let's talk a little bit about influence over our employees' careers. Every decision that we make as people leaders has an impact on our employees' lives. So for example, decisions around salary increases impact the decisions and choices that our employees get to make about what town or community to live in. How safe is it? They impact what food can I afford to feed my children? Is the food healthy? They impact where I can afford to send my child to school and where I can afford to send my children to university. Hiring decisions, starting pay, work allocation and prioritization, deciding who gets to work on what projects will have a huge impact on people's careers. Their professional development, as I talked about salary increases, who gets promoted, what kind of exposure assignments. So in terms of talent management, I would encourage you to think about not just what courses to send employees to or what salary increase to promote someone to, but think about exposure and reputation assignments. And here's what I mean by this. I have approximately 17 people who report to me on the Global People and Talent team at Rotary. And I recognize that in my capacity as Chief Human Resources Officer, I get to work every single day with Rotary's Chief Executive Officer. But my colleagues don't. And so I want to make sure that the CEO of Rotary knows who they are and knows what they're capable of. And so I provide them with opportunities for exposure to John Huco, Rotary's CEO. I find ways to get them in front of him. I have them present to him. I have him interact with them. I want him to not only know what their name is, but I want him to know what they're really good at. So when he's thinking about what the organization needs and what talent that will require, he knows who those people are. So giving employees exposure and reputation opportunities is a tremendous way to influence, motivate, and inspire performance. In terms of influence, there are really two ways that we know from psychology and behaviorism, and that is through positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. If you've ever dealt with children, you're an expert on this. If you deal with animals, if you have pets, you're probably really good at this as well. Positive influence, of course, is recognition and acknowledgement. When something happens that you want to have repeated, you have to do something to reinforce that behavior so that the person who's exhibiting the behavior knows that it was a good behavior and knows that we want more of it. Celebrating successes, making sure that we're highlighting people's achievements and letting them know that we see them. We see you. We see what you're doing, and we see how you're contributing. You matter to us. And rewards. And of course, by rewards, I mean adding something that's desirable or favorable to the person who's exhibiting the behavior we want, or letting them keep something that's desirable or favorable, or removing something that's unfavorable. Those are the three primary sources of rewards. And of course, in negative reinforcement, this is the old school way of managing people, always pointing out errors and what they do bad or what they do wrong, and punishing people by either adding something unfavorable, keeping something unfavorable, or removing something favorable, removing something that they enjoy or that they like. And of course, the old axiom is that we know that you get more bees with honey, right? So hopefully you'll use your influence with the positive reinforcement approach rather than a negative reinforcement approach. So a couple of questions that I would ask you to think about as you're thinking through using this material back on your job. If you were to reverse roles, in other words, if you were to report to yourself, what feedback would you give me if we were in opposite roles? If I was meeting with an employee, I might ask them, what can I do differently as your leader? What feedback would you give me? And creating psychological space and safety for them to be able to provide that feedback to me. And what do you think caused the outcome when something bad happens? We just talked about storytelling. Let me tell you a brief story. I had the pleasure of hiring a professional on the global human resources team who was responsible for employee benefits, compensation, payroll, and human resources information systems. And he was quite early in his career at Rotary, and he was making a presentation to our board of directors, and something went poorly. It was not going well. And after the board meeting, he went back to his office, and I went back to my office, and a little while later, he came knocking on the door, and he said, "When is it going to happen?" And I asked, "When is what going to happen?" And he said, "When are you going to tell me how terrible this went?" And I said, "I don't intend to tell you, because you already know. You already know what the experience was. I don't need to tell you something that is already obvious to you. And I'm not concerned about what went wrong and your role in it. What I'm more concerned about is not feedback, but feed forward. What are we going to take from this experience to inform what we'll do differently next time? How can we do a better job? How can we make sure to avoid those challenges and pitfalls that we encountered during that experience?" And he was mind blown. He was so used to having a manager who was going to tell him everything that he did wrong, everything that went poorly, and scold him. And that was just not what I was going to do. And so the good thing is that from that, I saw someone really grow and become very, very good at what he does. And I attribute that to largely what we're talking about today. Now, I told you that I'd share with you a model of performance. I want to thank my graduate students for the several years as I've been teaching human resources development at a university in Chicago for coming up with this really simple evaluation model. So I taught human resources development evaluation at the graduate level using a big textbook full of scholarly articles and ways to approach evaluation. And I realized that the students weren't really catching on to how to make sure you can evaluate things relatively quickly and fairly easily. And so let me offer you the 4 stages of evaluation that I started using with them and that I watched light bulbs go off because it made sense to them. The first is the expectation. You have to start with an expectation. What do you expect to happen? What is supposed to happen? Next is observation. What is actually happening? Third is evaluation. Is what's actually happening what is supposed to happen? Or is there some sort of gap? And then last is calibration. What needs to change and how? So, expectation, observation, evaluation, calibration. And this is linear, but it can be out of step as well. And it's also cyclical. It's a continuing cycle. And the reason I think this is important is because as human beings, we don't always share the story that we're telling ourselves about what we expect of others. So for example, when you're disappointed with your wife or your husband or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, it's probably because they are not meeting some expectation you have of them, But the question becomes, do they even know what that expectation is? Have you even communicated what you wanted or hoped that they would do? And all human suffering is when you attach to an idea or a story that either is not true or that other people are not aware of. So as people leaders, we are responsible for making it very clear to our employees what we expect of them. And then we watch. We stand back and we watch. And the question becomes, is what they're actually doing meeting expectations? If it is, how do we reinforce it? How do we introduce awards, recognition, things that will send a message to them that keep doing what you're doing well? If it's not, then we have to figure out how to influence their behavior so that we can help them meet our expectations. And that, of course, is the calibration process. Now, I want to share with you a formula that's called Campbell's Determinants of Performance. Anyone familiar with this work? A guy by the name of Campbell. He's an IO psychologist who wanted to figure out what are the variables that impact human performance. In other words, is it possible for us to know what goes into people, human beings, actually performing? And what he found was that there are 3 different variables or 3 different elements that must be present in order for performance to occur. The first one he called declarative knowledge. The second he called procedural knowledge, and the third he called motivation. Now in 2020, these terms, or in 2022 rather, these terms are not necessarily intuitive. They don't make a whole lot of sense to us. So let me walk you through a story, through an example of what this formula basically means. Declarative knowledge is what you know how to do. Procedural knowledge is what you're able to actually do. And motivation is your willingness to do it. So the question is, what do you know how to do? What are you actually capable of doing? And how willing are you to do it? So let me give you the story. I once read a book about how to fly a plane. How many of you would be willing to get on my plane? Oh, okay, somebody trusts me, thank you. But not many, and I don't blame you, because reading a book is only declarative knowledge. It only helps me learn something. It helps me acquire knowledge, but it's not skill-based. So you can read all the books in the world on leadership or management or flying a plane, and it doesn't mean you're good at it. It just means you know information about it. Even reading a book, I could, theoretically, explain to you what each of these levers and buttons and devices and contraptions are in the cockpit of an airplane. I could probably take a quiz and match, this is what this is. I could probably do that because that's declarative knowledge. But the question is, can I actually get behind the gears of a plane and fly it? That is skill. That is what Campbell called procedural knowledge. So you have to have knowledge, you have to know something, and you have to have skill. You have to have procedural knowledge, the ability to actually put your knowledge to use in doing something. Perhaps you've seen this old World War II poster when women were encouraged to join the workforce in the United States and around the world, that, we can do it. We got this. That's willingness to do something. And so the point of the story is that you have to have all 3. You have to know how to do something, you have to be able to do it, and you have to really want to do it in order for performance to occur. If we want that plane to take off, we need to have knowledge, we need to have skills, and we need to have willingness or motivation to fly the plane. So in addition to the work of Campbell, there was a guy who was studying under B.F. Skinner, who was trying to figure out, how do you engineer human behavior? In other words, can you manipulate people's behavior? Can you get them to do things? And so his work was happening at a separate time from Campbell and totally independent from Campbell, but I'm going to show you the parallels of the work that they did. This guy's name was Thomas Gilbert, and what he came up with was what he called human behavior engineering. And ultimately, he came up with a 6-box model. Some of you may be familiar with it or have seen it. It's not the 9-box talent management table. It's something completely different. I'm going to walk through and explain what this looks like. So he categorized declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and motivation using different terms. He called declarative knowledge information, which is more intuitive. He called skills instrumentation, which is still a little strange label to call skills, but he called motivation motivation. And he said that there are 2 different factors that you have to consider. One is the work environment and one is the employee. And let me give you some examples of what this means. So this is the 6-box model. So in the work environment, the question is, what information is present? In the work environment, what skills are required? And in the work environment, what are we offering our employees as incentives? And then the employee, what knowledge are they bringing to the job? What skills do they have? And how willing are they to perform? So he called information from the work environment perspective data. He called skills from the work environment perspective tools. And he called motivation from the work environment incentives. And I'll explain a little bit more about what these are. And then from the employee perspective, he called information knowledge, he called skills capabilities, and he called motivation motives. So let me show you what this includes. So data. Do managers clearly explain what is expected of employees? Do managers keep employees apprised on their performance? Do employees understand how their efforts contribute in meaningful ways? In other words, do people leaders and do employers provide this information to their employees to be successful? And then from the employee perspective, do they have the knowledge to be successful? Do they understand what's expected of them? Going back to expectation, observation, evaluation, calibration. Do they know what's expected? And do they use feedback to improve their performance? From a skills perspective, do we, as people leaders, do we provide our employees the tools necessary to perform their jobs well? Do we regularly maintain their tools and resources? In other words, if we buy them a laptop, do they have to use the same laptop for the next 10 years? Or are we constantly upgrading and making sure that they have the most up-to-date tools and resources necessary to be able to perform their job? And do the tools our employees need help them perform their job easier, better, or faster? And then from the employee's perspective, do they have the skills necessary to perform the job? And do they have the physical, mental, or emotional abilities to perform the job? Now, for those of us who are human resources professionals and those of us who are people leaders, understand that there was a time when we used to think personal stuff stays at home. Don't bring your personal baggage to the job. And imagine how difficult it was, or it would be, if your computer on a random Tuesday just decided, I'm not feeling really good today. And sometimes your computer does do that, but not because it's having an emotional reaction. But imagine if technology, imagine if computers were like people and they showed up with baggage. Imagine if the computer didn't sleep well and was fighting with its wife and its kid was causing problems and it was distracted. It couldn't really help you with that Word document you needed to get done, and I don't have time for that PowerPoint. Right? People are messy. That is human psychology. And we used to think that there was a wall between personal life and work life. And I'm here to tell you, ladies, we have to bring down that wall. Because when employees bring their baggage to work, it does impact their productivity. It does impact their ability to produce results. It does impact relationships. And we have to treat them that way. People want to be treated humanely and kindly. And part of this here under capabilities is, are we providing our employees with resources to be able to deal with that baggage? And I'm not suggesting that managers or people leaders need to become psychologists. What I am suggesting is that employers need to make sure that when employees are struggling with something that's not work-related, that they have some resource to turn to. So one of the examples from Rotary is that we provide all of our employees with an employee assistance program, a toll-free number that they can call and speak to someone about when they're struggling with finances, or they're struggling with finding daycare, or they're trying to take care of an elderly parent, whatever the case might be. Because we know that if you have peace of mind, knowing that someone is there for you to help you deal through those problems, you can use your knowledge and apply your skills, and you will be motivated to work. The last one is the one that I find most interesting, and that is under motivation. And generally, managers, I probably shouldn't say generally, but sometimes when an employee doesn't perform, the manager's default inclination is to think, well, they must be lazy or they must be dumb. And that's not true. It's just not true. The question is, do they have the knowledge to be able to do it? Can they actually do it? And are they willing to do it? And if they're not willing to do it, we know from the formula that no productivity will happen. So the question is, how can we try to motivate them? So from the employer's perspective, what incentives are we providing to our employees? Let me tell you, one of the most important incentives is giving people a good job to do. If you want people to do a good job, give them a good job to do. They want meaningful relationships, meaning if you are a people leader, take an active interest in them as a human being. Understand their passions. Understand what motivates and drives them. Be kind to them. In addition, are we providing fair pay, competitive benefits? Are we providing professional development opportunities? And do we have other non-monetary reward structures in place? And then the question is, what motives do employees bring to the job? We all have motives. We all have motives. The question is our employer providing incentives that match those motives? Another story. Several years ago, my father retired from working on the railroad, and he found himself really, really bored. And so I was on the phone with my mother, and she told me that my dad went to work. And I said, wait, I'm confused. We had a big retirement party for him. All of his friends came. I thought that he was done working. And she said, oh, yeah, he's just got really bored, so he wanted to go back to work. So he got a job as a handyman, a maintenance person working for a property management company. And so when I talked to my dad, I said, Dad, I'm confused. You spent all your life to get to this point, to retire and just live life and enjoy it. Why did you go back to work? You don't need the money. You don't need health insurance. You don't need those sort of forms of safety and security that the structure of employment provides you. What are you doing? And he said, I miss being around my coworkers. I miss my friends at work. And so what he was motivated by was being social and being active and engaged with other human beings. He built relationships with his colleagues, and he missed that. So he wanted to go back and replicate that. So the question is, was that employer providing the right incentives to meet his motive? And in that case, they were. So a quote from Thomas Gilbert as I wrap up here. For any given accomplishment, a deficiency in performance always has as its immediate cause a deficiency in a behavior repertoire, meaning the employee, or in the environment that supports the repertoire, meaning management, or both. Or both. So he's saying that if there's a problem with performance or productivity, it exists either at the employer level or the employee level, or in both. But its immediate cause will be found in a deficiency of the management system. Think about that. Sometimes when I present this to managers, they scoff because it feels like I'm saying that all performance problems are a manager's fault, and that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that people leaders have the ability to influence productivity and performance. And let me talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. The work of B.F. Skinner was to understand the behavior and performance of rats. You probably heard of a Skinner box, where Skinner conducted experiments in trying to figure out, can he manipulate the behavior of rats through rewards and punishments? And he learned that he could. And Thomas Gilbert learned that human beings are not much different than rats when it comes to being influenced by rewards and punishment. And so essentially what Thomas Gilbert was saying is that if a rat fails to perform in an experiment, the question is, whose fault is it? Is it the rat's fault, or is it the experimenter's fault? How many say it's the rat's fault? How many say it's the experimenter's fault? He said it's basically the experimenter's, not fault, but responsibility. It's the experimenter's responsibility. Because the experimenter has control. Going back to the sphere of control. The experimenter has control over choosing, selecting which rat to use for the experiment. Just like people leaders have the control over making hiring decisions. We choose who we're putting in our company. We choose that. The question is, did they choose the right rat or the right employee? If a rat becomes sick or unable to perform, are we providing care and comfort to try to get the rat back to speed? When an employee is dealing with personal issues, are we doing the same thing? Ultimately, what he's suggesting is that in all cases, people leaders have the responsibility to do whatever they can to try to remedy whatever deficiency exists in any of those 6 boxes in order to influence productivity and results. And that's not to say that if the employee still does not perform after all our efforts in trying to get them to perform, by teaching them new knowledge, by teaching them new skills, by providing the right incentives, if they're still not performing, whose responsibility is it to remove that person from the job and the company? It's ours, the people leaders. We have accountability for performance through selection, through treating and conditioning, in other words, deciding what work environment is going to look like, with whom other people are going to work, what responsibilities they're going to take on, those sorts of things. We have accountability for the training that they receive. We are responsible for coaching and mentoring. And when things aren't working, it is our responsibility to separate people. Because let me tell you, one bad apple can spoil a bunch. So, understand your impact. I have 2 questions here that I'd like you to think about. As a people leader, you are part of your employee's career story. How do you wish to be portrayed in their story? So going back to this idea of storytelling, what story do you want your direct reports to tell about you at their retirement party? When they are asked, what was it like to report to so-and-so? Or what was it like to work with Chris? What was that like? What story do you want to be told? And are you behaving the way that you deserve that story? And the second question, what do you want your direct reports to remember your contribution to their careers and lives being? If someone were to ask you, what was the most important thing Chris ever did for you in your career? What do you want them to say? And are you doing those things today? Think about that. My last call to action to you is to ask you, what is one thing you commit to doing differently as a result of this session? In other words, what will you start doing because of the time we spent here together? What will you do differently? Or perhaps even what will you stop doing? But this is my call to action to you. I've shared with you information today. I want you to go back and try to fly this plane. Be motivated and do something differently. Start doing something, do something differently, or stop doing something. And together, we will change the world by influencing productivity and results. So with that, namaste.